My name is Helen, I'm 72 years old, and my own son tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my home. Before I tell you how a judge I hadn't seen in 30 years stopped him dead in his tracks, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The courtroom was colder than a tomb. It wasn't just the marble floors or the heavy oak paneling that seemed to swallow the light. It was the chilling silence that fell every time the heavy doors swung open. I clutched my simple purse, my knuckles white, and tried to keep my breathing even. Across the aisle, my son Mark sat next to his wife Jessica. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just stared straight ahead, a muscle twitching in his jaw, looking like a stranger in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Jessica, on the other hand, had no trouble looking at me. She shot me a look that was pure triumphant ice. A small, cruel smirk played on her lips, a look that said, "It's over, old woman. You've lost." To see my only child, the boy I'd raised, the one whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose nightmares I had soothed, sitting there ready to testify that I'd lost my mind, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Their lawyer, a young shark with slicked back hair, leaned over and whispered something to them. They both nodded, their confidence radiating across the room like a foul odor. They thought this was a formality, a simple procedure to put their inconvenient old mother away and cash in on her house, the home my late husband David and I had built with our own two hands. My own lawyer, a kind but overworked public defender, gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. "Just stay calm, Helen. We stick to the facts." But how could I be calm? My heart felt like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. This wasn't about facts. This was about betrayal. A betrayal so deep it felt like it had hollowed me out from the inside. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, echoing through the cavernous room. We all stood, a stiff, awkward shuffling of feet on the cold floor. The side door opened and the judge entered. He was a tall man, maybe in his early 50s, with silvering hair at his temples and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He moved with the kind of quiet authority that commanded respect before he even opened his mouth. This was Judge Samuel Miller, the man my son believed would sign the papers that would strip me of everything I had left. He took his seat on the high bench, the black robes settling around him. The courtroom fell into a profound silence. He scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the lawyers, the court stenographer, and then it landed on me. And everything stopped. It wasn't a gradual recognition. It was instant. His professional mask didn't just slip, it shattered. His eyes, which had been cool and impartial just a second before, widened in sheer disbelief. He froze. I mean, completely still like a statue, his hand hovering over a stack of papers. The air in the room became thick, heavy. I could feel every eye in the room shift from him to me, trying to understand what was happening. Mark and Jessica exchanged a confused glance. Their lawyer frowned, looking back and forth between me and the judge, his confident posture faltering. Then his voice, barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the dead silence, carried across the room. "It's her." A wave of confusion washed over my son's face. Jessica's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure panic. And in that frozen moment, before anyone could speak, before the gavel could fall, I knew the game had just changed. Before that cold courtroom, before the lawyers and the whispers, my life was quiet. It was peaceful. My days in our little house in Oak Creek, Ohio, followed a simple rhythm, one David and I had perfected over 50 years of marriage. I'd wake up at dawn, the smell of fresh coffee and old memories filling the kitchen. Most mornings I'd spend an hour in the garden he'd loved so much, tending to his prize-winning roses. Their velvet petals and sweet scent were a constant reminder of him. His presence was in every corner of that house, in the worn spot on his leather armchair, in the scent of sawdust that still lingered in the garage, in the sturdy oak floors we'd laid together one sweltering summer. After he passed, Mark was all I had left. My boy. I had poured every ounce of myself into raising him, especially after he met Jessica. She was ambitious, driven. I told myself that was a good thing. I made excuses for her coolness, for the way she always seemed to be evaluating everything, from my old silverware to the value of our neighborhood. I told myself she was just different. The betrayal began on a Sunday evening, 3 months before the day in court. I'd spent all afternoon making David's favorite pot roast. the aroma filling the house with a warmth that felt like a hug. Mark and Jessica arrived right on time, all smiles and polite chatter. Mark gave me a stiff hug, Jessica a light kiss on the air beside my cheek. We sat down for dinner, and for a little while it almost felt normal. I asked Mark about his promotion at the firm. I asked Jessica about her new car. They gave short, polished answers. But after the plates were cleared, the mood shifted. A strange tension settled over the table. "Mom," Mark began, clearing his throat and avoiding my gaze. "Jessica and I have been talking." "Oh," I said, my hands busy folding my napkin in my lap. It was Jessica who took over, her voice smooth as glass. She pulled out a sleek tablet, its screen glowing in the dim dining room light. "We've been thinking about the future, Helen. About legacy." She swiped the screen, showing me glossy pictures of modern, open-concept homes. "This house has great bones, but it's dated. It's not being used to its full potential." My heart began to beat a little faster. "I don't understand, dear. What does this have to do with me?" She swiped again, this time to a 3D rendering of my own living room, but it was all wrong. The cozy, cluttered space was gone, replaced by gray walls, minimalist furniture, and cold, empty surfaces. Then my blood ran cold. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the main wall of the living room, the wall where David's portrait hung. A beautiful oil painting I'd commissioned for our 40th anniversary. It captured his kind eyes, the gentle laugh lines around his mouth. It was the heart of our home. "To really maximize the space," Jessica said, her voice clinical, "this entire wall would have to come down. It would create a fantastic sightline from the kitchen straight through to the back patio." I stared at her, speechless. The room felt suddenly airless. I looked at Mark, searching his face for some sign of protest, some flicker of the loving son I knew. I found nothing. He just sat there, nodding along like a puppet. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is she talking about?" He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Mom, we need the space. We're thinking of starting a family. And honestly, you can't keep this big place up by yourself anymore. It's a burden. We're offering you a solution." A solution? They were talking about erasing my husband, erasing my life, and calling it a solution. The pot roast I'd made with such love sat like a stone in my stomach. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table and stood up, my old bones protesting. "This is your father's house," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "That is your father's portrait. And as long as I am breathing, neither one is going anywhere. I think it's time for you to leave." Mark had the grace to look ashamed, but Jessica just smiled that thin, cold smile. She stood up, gathering her purse and tablet. "Oh, we'll be back, Helen," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And you won't like our next approach." True to her word, their next approach was something out of a nightmare. A few days later, I was in the backyard, pruning David's rose bushes, my hands deep in the familiar soil, trying to find some peace. That's when I heard the voices from inside my house. My heart leaped into my throat. I hadn't invited anyone over. I grabbed my garden trowel, its weight a small comfort, and crept to the back door. Peeking through the kitchen window, I saw Jessica. And with her was a man in a dusty polo shirt and a tool belt, a contractor. He was walking through my dining room, my sacred space, with muddy boots on my clean floor. I felt a surge of hot, protective anger. I burst through the door. "Jessica, what is the meaning of this? Who is this man?" She didn't even flinch. She turned with a serene smile, as if she had every right to be there. "Helen, darling, relax. This is Gary. I was just getting an estimate for the renovations. We have to know what we're working with." "You are working with nothing," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "This is my home. You don't just bring strangers into my home." The contractor, Gary, looked deeply uncomfortable. He shuffled his feet and mumbled, "Ma'am, she told me she was the new owner." "Well, she is not," I snapped, pointing the muddy trowel towards the door. "And you can leave. Now." He practically ran out of the house. Jessica, however, stood her ground. "You're being hysterical, Helen. This is exactly what Mark and I were worried about. You're getting emotional and irrational." She looked around my kitchen, her eyes cataloging every imperfection. "These pipes are ancient," she said to herself, loud enough for me to hear. The wiring is probably not up to code. This whole place is a liability. Every word was a calculated jab, designed to make me feel old, incompetent, and small in my own home. I stood there, trembling, as she finally swept out the door, leaving a trail of mud and humiliation behind her. But the invasion didn't stop at my front door. It seeped out into my life, poisoning the one place I always felt safe, my community. The following Sunday I went to church just like I had every week for the last 50 years. But something was wrong. People were looking at me differently. There were whispers behind cupped hands. My dear friend Martha, who usually saved me a seat, gave me a tight, pitying smile from across the aisle. After the service, a few people came up to me, their voices dripping with false concern. "Helen dear, are you doing all right? We're all so worried about you." Jessica called. "She told us you had a bit of a fall." I hadn't had a fall. I was perfectly fine. It hit me like a physical blow. Jessica had started a smear campaign. She was calling my friends members of my church, painting a picture of a frail, confused old woman who was a danger to herself. She was isolating me, turning my support system against me, laying the groundwork for their next move. She was making it seem like their greed was actually loving concern. That afternoon I got a phone call. It was my friend Martha. "Helen," she said, her voice hesitant. "Jessica told me you've been forgetting things. Misplacing your keys, leaving the stove on. She said Mark is worried sick about your inheritance and wants to protect it for you." The word hung in the air. Inheritance. It was never about my safety. It was about the money. The value of the house David had left me. I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. "Martha," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "She is lying." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Oh dear," Martha finally said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. I realized then that the war wasn't just for my house anymore. It was for my sanity, my reputation, my very identity. And I was completely, terrifyingly alone. The campaign of whispers and lies was just the softening up. The main attack came a week later. I was washing the lunch dishes when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. It was Mark and Jessica, and this time they brought backup. A man in a crisp, dark suit got out of the passenger side, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. A lawyer. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. I met them at the door. I didn't invite them in, but they pushed past me as if they already owned the place, heading straight for the dining room table. The same table where Jessica had laid out her tablet of horrors. Now her lawyer laid out his briefcase. He opened it with a series of sharp clicks that echoed in the silent house. "Mrs. Smith," the lawyer began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. His name was Mr. Davies. "My clients, your son and daughter-in-law, are deeply concerned for your well-being." I just stared at him, my arms crossed over my chest. "Save it. What do you want?" His polite smile didn't waver. He slid a thick stack of documents across the table towards me. The top page had bold letters that made my vision swim. Petition for conservatorship. "We feel, given your recent emotional outbursts and forgetfulness, that you are no longer in a condition to manage your own affairs," Mr. Davies continued. "This is a legal proceeding to have Mark appointed as your conservator. He would manage your finances, your property, your medical decisions." "You want to declare me incompetent," I said flatly. It wasn't a question. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. My own son was standing right there, watching this man tell me that I, the woman who had managed a household, raised a child, and cared for a dying husband, was now considered as helpless as an infant. "It's for your own good, Mom," Mark mumbled, still refusing to look at me. Jessica placed a hand on his arm. "We're protecting you from yourself, Helen. And we're protecting your assets. This house is a significant part of my husband's future inheritance." There it was again. Inheritance. The raw, ugly truth. "If you sign these papers voluntarily," the lawyer said, tapping a different document, "we can avoid a messy court battle. This one is a simple transfer of title for the property. Sign the house over to Mark and Jessica, and they will ensure you are placed in a very comfortable retirement community. All your needs will be taken care of." They weren't just trying to take my house, they were trying to take my life, my autonomy, my dignity. A fire I hadn't felt in years began to burn in my chest. I picked up the thick stack of papers, felt their insulting weight in my hands, and then I did the only thing that felt right. I tore them in half, the sound of ripping paper a satisfying scream in the quiet room. Mr. Davies's jaw dropped. Jessica gasped. Mark finally looked up, his eyes wide with shock. "Get out," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury I didn't know I possessed. "Get out of my house." The lawyer quickly gathered his torn papers, his professional composure gone. "You are making a grave mistake, Mrs. Smith. We will be filing this with the court. You will be served a summons. A judge will decide." "Let him," I said, pointing to the door. As they left, Jessica turned back at the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. "You will regret this," she hissed. "When you're sitting in a state-run home with nothing to your name, you'll remember this day." I slammed the door behind them, the frame rattling. I leaned against it, my legs feeling weak, my heart pounding. They were actually going to do it. They were going to drag me into court and tell a judge, tell the world that I was crazy. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over me. How could I fight them? I was a 72-year-old widow. They had money, a slick lawyer. What did I have? That night sleep wouldn't come. I wandered the dark, silent halls of my home, feeling like a ghost. I felt David's absence more acutely than ever. "Oh, David," I whispered into the darkness. "What do I do?" The next few days were a blur of anxiety. The official summons arrived in the mail, a cold, impersonal document that felt like a death sentence. The court date was set. I felt trapped, a fly caught in a web spun by my own family. In my darkest moments, I almost considered giving in just to make the pain stop. I was tired, so tired of fighting. One afternoon, seeking solace, I climbed the rickety pull-down stairs to the attic. It was my sanctuary of memories, dusty and smelling of cedar and thyme. I wanted to find David's old photo albums, to remind myself of the happy years, of the man who would have never let this happen. I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes filled with a lifetime of treasures. Mark's first-grade report cards, my wedding dress sealed in a box, David's old collection of model airplanes. I was rummaging through an old sea chest he brought back from his time in the Navy when my fingers brushed against something hard beneath a stack of old wool blankets. It was a metal box. A deep box, heavy and black with a tarnished brass latch and a small, sturdy lock. I'd never seen it before in my life. David had never mentioned it. My curiosity piqued. A small flicker of something other than despair sparked within me. Where would he keep the key? It had to be somewhere special. I thought back, trying to remember his habits, his secret hiding places. And then it hit me. His favorite book. A worn, leather-bound copy of The Wealth of Nations that he kept on his bedside table. He always said it contained all the secrets to a good life. My heart pounded as I hurried down the stairs. I pulled the book from the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I fanned the pages. Tucked inside a small hollow he must have carved out himself was a tiny, ornate brass key. It fit the lock on the box perfectly. With a click, the lid sprang open. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and ink. Inside, there were no photos, no sentimental trinkets. It was filled from bottom to top with neat stacks of official-looking documents, bound with string. Contracts, stock certificates, bank statements from banks I'd never heard of, and deeds. Dozens of them. Deeds to commercial properties downtown, a plot of land out by the lake, and my breath hitched. I pulled out a thick folder labeled Oakview Luxury Apartments. I recognized the name immediately. It was the brand new upscale building where Mark and Jessica lived. The one they were always bragging about, with its rooftop pool and state-of-the-art gym. I frantically read through the legal papers, my mind struggling to comprehend the dense language. But the conclusion was unmistakable. The building, all 60 units of it, didn't belong to some faceless corporation. It belonged to a holding company, and the sole owner of that company was listed as David R. Smith. Now it was mine. For the past 3 years, my son and his wife had been paying rent thousands of dollars a month for an apartment that I owned. The money had been quietly funneling into a trust account, managed by a firm I'd never heard of, accumulating, waiting. I felt faint. I sank onto the edge of the bed. The papers spread out around me. David, my quiet, unassuming David, who drove a 10-year-old Ford and wore sweaters until they were threadbare, had secretly built an empire. He had made me a millionaire many times over and I had never known. Why Why would he keep this from me? At the very bottom of the box, beneath all the legal documents, was a single sealed envelope with my name, Helen, written in his familiar steady hand. My hand shook so badly I could barely tear it open. The letter inside was dated just 6 months before he passed away. I began to read, and his voice seemed to fill the room. My dearest Helen, it began. If you are reading this, then my worst fear has come true, and someone is trying to take advantage of your good heart. Forgive me for this secret, my love, but I knew that if you were aware of this money, you would have given it all away to anyone who asked. I built this to protect you, to ensure you would never have to fear or want for anything in your later years, when I could no longer be there to guard you. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the words. I read on. I must also be frank about our son. I love him, but I see his weakness. And I see the greed in his wife's eyes. It worries me more than I ever let on. That is why I arranged things this way. This wealth is your shield, Helen. It is your sword. Use it wisely. Not to hurt, but to teach. To protect yourself with a strength they will never see coming. I clutched the letter to my chest, a sob escaping my lips. Even from beyond the grave, David was protecting me. He had given me a shield. He had given me a sword. And as I looked at the court summons lying on my dresser, I knew exactly how I was going to use them. The letter from David was a lifeline. It didn't just reveal a secret fortune. It gave me back my strength, my purpose. It was a reminder that I wasn't just some helpless old woman. I was David Smith's wife, and he had believed in my ability to be strong. The next morning, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter. I made my coffee, my hand steady for the first time in weeks. I found a name and a number in the documents for a firm called Vance Financial Services, and a contact person, Sarah Vance. I dialed the number, my heart thrumming with a nervous energy. Sarah Vance speaking. Her voice was warm and professional. Miss Vance, I began, taking a deep breath. My name is Helen Smith. I was married to David Smith. There was a moment of silence on the other end, then a soft, knowing sigh. Mrs. Smith, she said, her tone full of warmth. We've been waiting for your call. That afternoon, I walked into an office of glass and polished steel that felt like another world. Sarah Vance was a woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. She didn't look at me with the pity or condescension I'd grown used to. She looked at me with respect. Please call me Helen, I said, sinking into a plush leather chair. Helen, then, she smiled. David was more than a client. He was a mentor and a friend. He spoke of you constantly. He called you his moral compass. I placed the metal box on her gleaming desk. I found this yesterday. I had no idea. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. That was David's way. He said you were the hardest working person he knew, and he worried you'd never rest if you knew there was a safety net. He wanted you to enjoy your life, not just endure it. She turned her large computer monitor towards me. Let me show you what he built for you. For the next hour, my world tilted on its axis. Sarah walked me through a dizzying portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings. Apartment buildings like the one Mark and Jessica lived in, a small shopping plaza on the other side of town, even a block of shares in a tech company that had since exploded in value. The numbers on the screen had so many zeros I couldn't even process them. So the rent checks from my son. I started, still trying to grasp it. Go into a blind trust account managed by a property management company David set up years ago, she finished. It was a brilliant structure. It ensures complete anonymity for the owner. They have absolutely no idea they've been paying you all this time. A slow, burning anger began to replace my shock. They were trying to steal my modest little house while living in luxury on my dime. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Then Sarah's expression turned serious. Helen, there's something else David asked me to do. After he became ill, he had concerns about Mark's financial situation and Jessica's influence. He hired a private investigator. My stomach clenched. What did you find? Nothing criminal back then, she said carefully, pulling a thick file from her desk drawer. But a clear pattern. Mark had significant gambling debts before he met Jessica. She seemed to pay them off, but the spending continued. Expensive trips, cars, a lifestyle well beyond their declared salaries. David suspected Jessica was pushing Mark into risky investments, and he was right. She opened the file. Inside were records of failed business ventures, loans taken out against his future inheritance, even evidence of a promotion he'd been passed over for at his law firm due to unreliable behavior. He wasn't the successful lawyer he pretended to be. He was drowning in debt. It all clicked into place. The desperation, the rush to get me declared incompetent, the cruelty. It wasn't just greed. It was a frantic attempt to grab a life raft before they went under. "He's desperate," I whispered. "He is," Sarah confirmed. "And he sees your house, your primary asset as far as he knows, as his only way out." I looked down at David's letter, which I'd brought with me. Use it not to hurt but to teach. He hadn't just left me money. He had left me information. He had left me power. I had come into that office a frightened widow. I was about to walk out a different woman. At this point I knew I had two choices. Continue to be the victim in their story, or start writing a new chapter of my own. And I think you all know which one I chose. Stay with me because this is where the plan began to take shape. Leaving Sarah Vance's office that day, I felt like I was walking on air. The weight of fear that had been crushing me for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to their attacks. I was planning my own defense. A defense David had so carefully prepared for me. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I met with Sarah and a team of shrewd, no-nonsense lawyers she recommended. They were David's old guard, fiercely loyal to his memory and, by extension, to me. We pored over every document, every financial statement, every piece of information the private investigator had gathered. A plan formed, a plan that was precise, legal, and absolutely devastating. I decided the first move had to be mine, and it had to be personal. I waited until the following Saturday morning. Called Mark. "I need to talk to you and Jessica," I said, my voice even and calm. "I have a proposal that might end all of this unpleasantness. Please come to the house at noon." I could hear the triumphant smirk in Jessica's voice in the background. "See? She's finally cracking." They agreed immediately, no doubt thinking I was about to surrender. I spent the morning preparing. I didn't bake or cook. Instead, I sat at David's old desk and arranged a few key documents in a neat pile. The deed to their apartment building, a summary of the rental income they had paid into my trust, and a formal, legally drafted eviction notice. They arrived precisely at noon, walking into my home with an air of conquerors. Jessica was already talking about which real estate agent to use, while Mark looked around with a new, appraising eye. "I'm glad you've decided to be reasonable, Mom," Mark said, taking a seat at the dining room table without being invited. "Oh, I am always reasonable," I replied, remaining standing. "I've come to realize you're right. Your current living situation isn't sustainable." Jessica's eyes lit up. "Exactly. Once we sell this place, we can get a proper family home." "No, that's not what I mean," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her chatter. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I walked over to the table and calmly placed the deed down in front of them. "I mean your apartment." Mark frowned, confused. "What about our apartment?" "It's a lovely building," I said conversationally. "The Oakview. Top-of-the-line amenities, I hear. It must cost a fortune in rent." "We manage," Jessica said stiffly, a hint of suspicion creeping into her voice. "I'm so glad you do," I said, sliding the next document on top of the deed. It was a ledger showing 3 years of their rental payments, totaling over $100,000, all deposited into an account under the name of the DRS Trust. Because every single penny of that rent has been coming directly to me. The color drained from Jessica's face. She looked like she'd been slapped. Mark snatched the papers, his eyes scanning them frantically. "What is this? This has to be some kind of joke. A forgery." "I assure you it's all perfectly legal," I said, my voice like steel. I placed the final document on the pile. The eviction notice. "I have decided to terminate your lease. You have 30 days to vacate my property." The explosion was immediate. "You can't do this," Mark roared, slamming his fist on the table. "My beautiful oak table. This is insane. You're a vindictive old woman." "I am the owner of your building," I replied simply. "And I am evicting a tenant." 2 tenants, actually. Jessica just stared at me, her mind clearly racing, the gears turning as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. She had targeted a little old lady in a small mortgaged house, only to find out she'd been living as a guest in the Queen's castle all along. The shock on her face was deeply, profoundly satisfying. "We'll sue you," Mark threatened, his face red and blotchy. "We'll tell the judge about this. You'll do nothing," I said, my voice dropping. "Because this is only the beginning of what I know about you, Mark. About both of you." He faltered, a flicker of fear in his eyes. For the first time he realized he wasn't dealing with his frail, emotional mother anymore. He was dealing with David Smith's wife. But just as I thought I had them cornered, Jessica did something I never expected. Her face crumpled, tears began to stream from her eyes, and she let out a choked sob. She looked from me to Mark, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "Mark, tell her," she cried, her voice thick with panic. "Tell her why she can't do this to us. Tell her now." My son looked trapped, a cornered animal. He stared at his crying wife, then at my unyielding face. "Mom," he stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw desperation. "Jessica, she's pregnant." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A grandchild. The one thing I had longed for, the one thing I thought might heal the growing rift in our family. And they were using it now, in this moment, as a weapon. As a shield. It was the most cynical, manipulative move imaginable, and for a split second it almost worked. My resolve wavered. The image of a tiny, innocent baby, my own flesh and blood, being caught in this ugly war. It was almost too much to bear. But then I saw the look that passed between them. A quick, furtive glance from Jessica to Mark that said, "It's working." And I heard David's voice in my head, clear as a bell. "Protect yourself." I took a slow, steadying breath. "A baby is a blessing," I said, my voice soft but firm. "It is not, however, a get-out-of-jail-free card. My decision stands. 30 days. The fight went out of them then. They left not with a bang but with a whimper. A cloud of stunned disbelief hanging over them. I had won the battle, but the news of the baby left a hollow ache in my heart. The joy was tainted by their deceit. I didn't hear from them for 2 weeks. The silence was heavy, unnerving. Then one Friday night my phone rang. It was the night manager of the Oakview Apartments. "Mrs. Smith," he said, his voice urgent. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's been a major incident in Unit 12B. Mark Smith's unit." My blood ran cold. "Is everyone all right?" "Yes, ma'am, his wife wasn't home. But Mr. Smith came in about an hour ago, clearly intoxicated. Well, he destroyed the place. We had to call the police. He was shouting about his inheritance, about being cheated. They took him in to sleep it off." The next morning Jessica called me, sobbing hysterically. She had nowhere else to go. I told her to come to the house. When she arrived, she looked like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes swollen. She told me she had spent the last 2 weeks trying to reason with Mark, trying to get him to apologize to me, but his pride and anger wouldn't let him. The eviction notice had sent him into a downward spiral of drinking and paranoia. "I need to get my things," she whispered. "My personal belongings. Can you come with me, Helen? I'm afraid to go alone." I agreed. We drove to the apartment in a tense silence. The manager let us in, and the scene that greeted us was one of pure, violent rage. Furniture was overturned, lamps were shattered. A large mirror hung cracked on the wall. But what was worse were the jagged, angry holes punched in the drywall. It looked like a wild animal had been let loose. Jessica moved through the wreckage like a sleepwalker, tears streaming down her face. As we began to carefully pack her clothes and personal items, she stopped at Mark's desk, which had somehow remained intact. "There's a drawer he always kept locked," she said, her voice numb. "He told me it was just old work files." She jiggled the handle. It was still locked. I remembered an old trick from my girlhood, and after a moment of fiddling with a hairpin from my purse, the lock clicked open. We both peered inside. It wasn't work files. It was a folder, neatly labeled, HS Estate Planning. My initials. Her hands shaking, Jessica pulled it out and opened it on the floor amidst the debris. My stomach churned as we looked at the contents. There were detailed appraisals of my house. brochures for the cheapest, most depressing retirement homes in the state. And then we saw it. A stack of legal documents. A durable power of attorney form. A healthcare directive. Even a sworn statement, written by Mark, detailing my supposed episodes of dementia, filled with fabricated stories and twisted half-truths. All of them were waiting for my signature. But the last page was the worst. It was a pre-filled out form, ready to be submitted to the court. It was the petition for conservatorship we had seen before. But this one was different. This one already had a signature on the line designated for the co-petitioner, Jessica Smith. Jessica stared at it, her face a mask of horror. "I never saw this," she whispered, her voice rising with panic. "I never signed this. Helen, I swear to you. That's not my signature." He had forged it. He was so sure he could manipulate her into going along with his plan that he had forged her name on a legal document to strip me of my rights. It wasn't just about greed anymore. This was a level of cold, calculated deception that was truly monstrous. We sat there, on the floor of that ruined apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my son's lies, and I knew this fight was far from over. It had just entered a much darker, more dangerous phase. Seeing Jessica's forged signature on that document was like a switch being flipped in my mind. The sorrow and hurt I felt were suddenly burned away by a cold, hard anger. This was no longer just a family dispute. My son had committed a felony. He had been willing to defraud the court and implicate his own pregnant wife in a criminal act. "We need to take this," I said, my voice firm as I gathered the papers. "We need to call Sarah Vance. Now." Back at my quiet house, which now felt like a fortress in a storm, we laid everything out on the kitchen table. The forged documents, the pictures I took of the destroyed apartment, the story of Mark's arrest for disorderly conduct. When Sarah Vance arrived an hour later, she looked at the evidence, her face growing grimmer by the minute. "This changes everything, Helen," she said. "This is forgery, fraud, attempted elder abuse. This is hard time. We can end this." She paused, looking at Jessica's pale, tear-streaked face. "But it will be a public, ugly fight. A criminal trial." Jessica flinched, her hand going to her belly. The thought of dragging her unborn child's father through a criminal court was clearly tearing her apart. "Isn't there another way?" I asked, my own heart aching at the thought. Sarah tapped her pen on the table, a thoughtful look in her eye. "David mentioned someone to me years ago. Failsafe, he called him. A person of unimpeachable character that he trusted implicitly. A man who owed him a great debt. Judge Samuel Miller." The name sent a jolt through me. A memory from a lifetime ago. "Sammy Miller?" I whispered. Sarah looked surprised. "You know him." How could I explain? It wasn't just knowing him. Long before he was Judge Miller. He was just Sammy, the skinny, brilliant teenage son of my dearest friend, Eleanor, who had been taken by cancer far too soon. I had made a promise to her on her deathbed that I would look out for her boy. And I had. David and I both had. We'd been the closest thing he had to parents. I was there at his high school graduation. David helped him write his college application essays. When he got into a prestigious law school but couldn't afford the tuition, David had quietly set up a college fund. An anonymous scholarship that covered his entire 3 years. We never told him it was us. We just wanted to see him succeed, for his mother's sake. We hadn't seen him in person in decades, after he moved away to build his career, but we had followed his rise to the bench with immense pride. "Yes," I said to Sarah, my voice thick with emotion. "I know him." "Then we have a path," Sarah said decisively. "We can request a private preliminary hearing in his chambers, citing extreme family circumstances. We present this evidence not as a criminal complaint, but as grounds to enforce a settlement. We can give Mark a choice. Face a litany of felony charges that will send him to prison for years, or walk away with nothing and never bother you again." It was a brilliant strategy. It was a way to win, to protect myself, without utterly destroying the father of my grandchild. A week later, we were ushered into Judge Miller's private chambers. He stood when I walked in and the years melted away. He was no longer the imposing judge, but the boy I remembered, albeit with graying hair and the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Helen," he said, his voice filled with a warmth that brought tears to my eyes. He came around his desk and gave me a gentle hug. I was so sorry to hear about David, and I am even more sorry that we are meeting under these circumstances. For the next hour, with Sarah presenting the facts and Jessica quietly corroborating the story, I laid everything out for him. The threats, the lies, the smear campaign, the forged signature. I watched his face shift from warm reminiscence to stony anger. He looked at the forged document, his jaw tightening. When I was finished, he sat in silence for a long time, looking at the picture of David on his credenza. "David and you paid for my law school, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the photo. I just nodded, unable to speak. He finally looked at me, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "What your son has done is not just an attack on you, Helen. It is an attack on everything you and David stood for. It's an attack on his mother's memory." He stood up, his demeanor all business now. "I cannot officially preside over this case due to our personal connection. However, I can and will preside over the preliminary hearing regarding the conservatorship he filed against you. I will ensure it is held in my courtroom." He walked me to the door, his hand on my shoulder. "Helen," he said, his voice low. "Let him come to court. Let him make his case. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes who is sitting on the bench." And so we returned to that cold courtroom. But this time I wasn't filled with fear. I was filled with a quiet, sorrowful strength. I was there not just for myself but for David, for Eleanor, and for the kind, decent boy Samuel Miller had been. When Judge Miller walked in and his eyes locked with mine, the shock on his face wasn't just recognition. It was the sudden dawning horror of a man realizing he was about to sit in judgment of a case involving someone who was practically his own family. The whispered, "It's her," wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of a nightmare. He composed himself with the practice of 1,000 cases, but I could see the steel in his eyes. The game had indeed changed. Mark's lawyer, Mr. Davies, clearly sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere but didn't understand it. He launched into his prepared speech, his voice ringing with false sincerity. He painted a picture of a loving son, worried sick about his confused, elderly mother. He spoke of my irrational behavior, my episodes of paranoia. He presented the torn conservatorship papers as proof of my instability. I sat there and listened, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. To hear my life, my love for my son, twisted into this ugly caricature was a unique kind of pain. When he was finished, Judge Miller looked down at him from the bench. "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "before I hear from Mrs. Smith's counsel, I feel I must make a disclosure to the court. I have a personal acquaintance with Mrs. Smith." Mr. Davies's face lit up. "Aha! Your Honor, in that case we must demand a recusal. This is a clear conflict of interest." "Oh, I agree, Counselor. It is a conflict," Judge Miller said, his eyes drilling into Mark. "You see, I've known Helen Smith since I was 10 years old. She was my mother's best friend. When my mother passed away, Helen and her husband David stepped in. They made sure I had food on the table. They helped me with my homework. They guided me, they mentored me, and when I thought my dream of becoming a lawyer was impossible, they paid my way through law school. So yes, you could say I know her character quite well." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Mr. Davies stood frozen, his mouth agape. Jessica started to quietly cry. And Mark, the color drained completely from his face. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Judge Miller wasn't finished. He turned to my lawyer. "Does the defense have anything to present?" Sarah Vance stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We have evidence of forgery, extensive gambling debts, and a pattern of fraudulent behavior on the part of Mr. Mark Smith, who we believe filed this petition in bad faith to gain control of his mother's assets to cover his own financial ruin." She laid it all out. The forged document was projected onto a screen for the entire court to see. The photos of the destroyed apartment. The police report. It was a methodical, brutal dismantling of their entire case. When she was done, Judge Miller looked at my son. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by the cold fire of justice. "Mr. Smith," he said, his voice thundering through the courtroom, "you came into this sacred hall and you attempted to use the law as a weapon against the very woman who raised you. You slandered her name. You tried to steal her home and her freedom. You did this not out of concern, but out of pure rotten greed. This petition is not only denied, it is an insult to this court and everything it stands for. He banged his gavel, the sound like a gunshot. Furthermore, based on the evidence of forgery and fraud presented here today, I am ordering the district attorney to open an immediate criminal investigation into you and your wife. No, Jessica shrieked, jumping to her feet. I didn't sign it. He did it. I didn't know. Judge Miller's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at her. That will be for the investigators to determine, ma'am. He then looked back at Mark. Bailiff, take Mr. Smith into custody pending investigation. 2 uniformed officers moved towards my son. He just sat there, completely broken, a hollow shell of the confident man who had walked in that morning. As they pulled him to his feet and put his hands behind his back, his eyes finally met mine across the room. There was no anger in them, only a look of utter, devastating shame. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. As I watched them lead my only child away in handcuffs, all I felt was the crushing weight of a mother's broken heart. The aftermath was quiet and gray. The storm had passed, leaving wreckage in its wake. Mark was charged with fraud and forgery, faced with the mountain of evidence, and with Jessica agreeing to testify against him, his lawyer quickly arranged a plea deal. He was sentenced to 2 years in a minimum security prison. 2 years. My son in prison. The words felt foreign, impossible. The charges against Jessica were dropped due to her cooperation. She was left with nothing. No husband, no home, and a baby on the way. The day after the sentencing, she showed up on my doorstep, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. She was carrying a single suitcase. I have nowhere else to go, Helen, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But my baby deserves a grandmother. Every rational part of me wanted to slam the door in her face. She had stood by while her husband tried to destroy me. But looking at her, at the swell of her stomach where my grandchild was growing, I saw not the conniving woman from the courtroom, but a scared, broken girl who had made a terrible mistake. And I thought of David. I thought of his letter. Not to hurt but to teach. Come in, Jessica, I said, my voice tired. The guest room is ready. Living together was difficult. It was an awkward dance of unspoken resentments and hesitant apologies. There were days the silence in the house was so thick I could barely breathe. She tried to help, cooking and cleaning, her gestures clumsy and desperate. I accepted them with a quiet nod. We didn't talk about Mark. We didn't talk about the court case. We talked about the baby. We went to doctor's appointments together. I felt the baby kick for the first time, a tiny fluttering miracle against my palm. We painted the spare room a soft sunny yellow. We assembled a crib, my old hands and her young ones working together, fumbling with screws and instructions. In these small shared moments a fragile truce began to form. I wasn't forgiving her, not yet, but I was making space. Space for the baby. Space for the possibility of something new. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Jessica went into labor. I held her hand through 18 hours of pain and fear, whispering words of encouragement, the same words my own mother had once whispered to me. And then he was here. A tiny, perfect baby boy with a tuft of dark hair and David's determined chin. They placed him in my arms and the world just stopped. All the anger, all the bitterness, all the pain of the past year melted away. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was this new life. This innocent soul, this continuation of our family. Jessica watched me from the hospital bed, her eyes full of tears. What should we name him? She asked softly. I looked down at the baby, my heart so full I thought it might burst. His name is David, I said. David Mark Smith. Many people might ask why I'd give her a second chance. Why I would open my home and my heart to the woman who helped plot my downfall. But my story isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about rebuilding from the ashes, and sometimes the only way to do that is to choose grace over grievance. But this was just the beginning of our new life. Stay with me for the final part of my story, and I'll tell you how we turned this painful chapter into a legacy of hope. Bringing little David home changed everything. The old house, which had been filled with silence and ghosts, was suddenly alive with the sounds of a new generation. Gurgles and coos replaced the heavy quiet. The scent of baby powder mingled with the fragrance of my husband's roses. Life was moving forward. Jessica was a wonderful mother. Seeing her with her son, her face soft with a love so fierce and pure, I finally saw the woman she could have been all along, before greed and ambition had twisted her. She worked hard to earn back my trust, not with grand gestures, but with small, consistent acts of kindness. She took over the cooking. She insisted I rest. She started helping me in the garden, learning the names of all the different roses, her hands once so pristine, now smudged with honest dirt. One evening as we sat on the porch watching the fireflies, she turned to me. "Helen," she said, her voice quiet. "I know I'm sorry will never be enough, but I want to spend my life making amends. Not just to you but for what Mark did." That conversation sparked an idea born from the pain we had endured. I looked at the vast fortune my David had left me, a fortune that was just sitting in accounts growing. Felt wrong. It was a shield I no longer needed. It was time to turn it into something more. With Sarah Vance's expert guidance, I used a significant portion of the inheritance to establish a nonprofit foundation. We bought a large, beautiful old house on the other side of town and renovated it. It became a sanctuary, a safe haven for elderly people who were facing what I had faced: financial abuse, neglect, or betrayal at the hands of their own families. We provided free legal counsel, temporary housing, and a community of support. We called it David's Rose Garden, a place where people who had been trampled on could come to heal and bloom again. Jessica threw herself into the project. She went back to school and got a degree in social work, specializing in elder care. She became the foundation's director, her own painful story giving her a unique empathy and a fierce determination to help our residents. She used her mistake not as a source of shame, but as a source of strength. Mark was released from prison after serving 18 months. He was a changed man, humbled, quiet, and full of a deep, sorrowful remorse. He never asked for my forgiveness. He only said he would spend the rest of his life trying to be a man his son could be proud of. He and Jessica started the slow, painful process of rebuilding their marriage, going to counseling, their relationship now based on honesty instead of ambition. He took a modest job with a small local firm, and they eventually moved into a small apartment of their own, just a few blocks away. Today my life is fuller than I ever could have imagined. My house is filled with laughter. Little David, who is now 5, has his grandfather's kind eyes. He loves to help me in the garden, his small hands carefully tending the roses. The foundation has flourished, with 3 houses now operating across the state, helping hundreds of vulnerable seniors reclaim their dignity and their lives. Sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch at dusk, watching my grandson chase fireflies across the lawn, I think about the long, painful journey that brought me here. I learned that betrayal from your own blood is one of the deepest wounds a person can endure. But I also learned that you are so much stronger than you think. Strength isn't about shouting or fighting. It's about standing firm in your truth, even when your legs are shaking. It's about protecting yourself not with walls but with wisdom. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, but it's important. So many people, especially women of our generation, suffer these heartbreaks in silence, made to feel ashamed or powerless. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against the people who were supposed to love you most, please share your experience in the comments below. Let's show each other that we are not alone. Your story matters. You matter. Please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories that remind us of our own strength.